Despite being almost invulnerable to the legions of aliens that have threatened Earth over the years, Superman is consistently beaten down by the spiteful scorn of critics and passionate cries of comic-loving gamers. The last son of Krypton's previous 3D outings, Shadow of Apocalypse, Man of Steel, and the worst game of all time, Superman 64, have left some wondering if the boy in blue is cursed when it comes to video games. We would love to tell you that Superman Returns changes all of this, especially with the power of the Xbox 360. But Microsoft's white box seems to be pumped full of kryptonite because mediocrity returns as well.
Is that the best you can do?
The reviews of this year's summer blockbuster condemned it for having too much story and not enough action. Perhaps in response to this, the game does the exact opposite. There are a handful of pre-rendered cinemas with both the likenesses and the voices of Brandon Routh, Kevin Spacey, Kate Bosworth, and Parker Posey. But these scenes merely act as updates on characters you would otherwise never see in the game. Lex Luthor and Lois Lane make their only appearances in these skimpy cutscenes. The other cameos include Bizarro, Metallo, Mongul, and Mr. Mitzelplixel, or however you say his name. There are also new interstellar baddies created by Electronic Arts. These extra faces are expected to help bulk out the thin plotline from the film, but Superman seems to recognize them from previous encounters we know never happened, if Returns is supposed to be a direct sequel to Superman 2. It's smart to include extra villains, but it would also be nice to take Lois Lane on a midnight flight from her apartment, or visit Clark Kent's pad or office at the newspaper. As far as the game is concerned, these places don't exist. The first thing you'll notice when you take to the skies above Metropolis is how ridiculously huge the city is. The map covers a staggering 80 square miles, which may or may not be bigger than San Andreas, but the city itself is undoubtedly the largest ever created for a video game. This makes it all the more painful when you realize how little there is to do there. You can transform into Bizarro at scattered spots, or chase a top hat-wearing magical midget through hoops, but there are only a few minigames outside of the random skirmishes you have to survive to complete the story. It doesn't even have the random crimes that everyone thought were so repetitive in Spider-Man 2. You'll start to wish you could help that annoying little girl find her damn balloon after a few missions. The only real landmarks throughout town are the Daily Planet office and a statue of Superman. Everything else is just a bulging cluster of tall buildings. And despite the insane size of the open world environment, you can't go underwater. Superman 64 is nothing to emulate, but at least that game let you drop below the ocean's surface. The mission structure is similar to Spider-Man 2, but it ends up getting in the way of the story like it did in Saints Row. In order to get to the next chapter, you have to gather up enough experience by discovering and fixing random events around Metropolis. When you finish one red alert, the game requires you to fly around a while before another pops up. This not only gives you the plot in minuscule, unsatisfying doses, it makes the few events you can do incredibly repetitive. There are only about a dozen enemy types you'll face, and between beating them up and putting out fires, there's a depressing amount of variation in the standard missions. There are also no human enemies in the game. Everything is either an evil robot, alien, or mutant monster. It would have been a welcome change of pace and entertaining opportunity to flex your godlike powers to stop a burglary, or chase a purse snatcher every now and then. To help you get around, you can travel at supersonic speeds with a click of a button. This causes the wind to howl as you tear through the sky, and the world to blur past as you skim the rooftops. You'll even break the sound barrier a couple of times as you zoom across the skyline. It's an impressive visual feat. But the effect clicks on and off the instant you tap the button. It would have been much more realistic if your perspective was gradually stretched as you flew faster. One of the biggest differences between Superman Returns and other superhero open-world games is that Superman doesn't have a health meter, which makes sense considering he's virtually indestructible. You can't die, but the city can, or at least be damaged beyond Superman's tolerance. The meter has to last you an entire chapter, unless you save your game, and can be replenished by bringing injured civilians to ambulances. The Metropolis meter makes sense, but it gives each battle a growing urgency that might prevent you from experimenting with Superman's powers, because you have to get the job done quickly. Travel is always a big issue when it comes to sandbox action games, and there's probably no cooler way to get around than to just take to the air like a rocket. The flying controls when you're touring the city are almost pitch perfect. No matter how monotonous your activities become, it's always a thrill to leap a tall building in a single bound or dodge skyscrapers at breakneck speeds. Combat is a different story, mainly due to the loose lock-on camera. There are several times when the action gets so frantic, you'll lose a target lock, even if you've been consistently holding the button down. Some enemies even seem to have the ability to shake themselves out of it right in front of you, which is almost insulting. And even when you do stay glued to a particular enemy, they'll rarely stay on screen for long. Most of the bad guys move pretty fast, and it's a constant source of frustration trying to keep your sights and your attacks positioned firmly within range. To add to the messy fighting, you can't punch enemies when they're on their backs. So it's not a good idea to use heavy attacks on certain bad guys, because when they hit the ground, you're forced to stand there and wait until they get back up to continue pounding them. With a slowly depleting metrometer, you don't always have the time to sit around and let each creature get back on their feet. You have three main powers: Force Breath, Ice Breath, and Heat Vision. You can assign these by pressing left, right, and up on the directional pad respectively, and fire them with the right trigger. You'll often be caught in fights that require you to switch back and forth between them at a moment's notice, and thankfully, Superman will tell you when one of them isn't having an effect. Your powers deplete surprisingly fast though, and unless you're in direct sunlight, it can take a couple of seconds to get them back. The good news is, if you ever get sick of the campaign objectives, and you will, you can morph into Bizarro and tear up the city. His controls and powers work similarly to Superman, except he gets extra credit for destroying downtown. But even this excitement wears off after a while, as he can't throw or drop people, and you're always trying to beat the clock. While it has its moments, traveling through Metropolis in Superman Returns isn't as fun as it was to tour New York in Spider-Man 2, and the combat isn't as rewarding as the charged-up combo system and the Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction. So while the game exceeds these other superhero ventures by technical standards, it's rarely as fun as either. Superman Returns looks like a passable game, and it definitely feels like one when you first start playing it. 6 or 7 hours later, when you've done absolutely everything Metropolis has to offer, you'll be shocked at how little they sprinkled over the obscenely huge environment. Fans of the film and free-roaming adventures will definitely be enticed to try it out, but anyone who actually plays it will be disappointed in its obvious lack of depth and variety.
This fight is over.